"I am innocent. I didn't kill anyone." These were the final words of Claude Jones before he was executed in Texas in 2000. Years later, DNA testing proved that a crucial piece of evidence used against him, the hair found at the crime scene, did not belong to him. Today we take a closer look at 20 individuals who were put to death, only to be exonerated after their execution. 15. Carlos de Luna. Carlos de Luna was convicted and sentenced to death for the brutal 1983 stabbing of Wanda Lopez, a gas station clerk in Corpus Christi, Texas. Lopez was murdered during a robbery, and de Luna was arrested nearby after being spotted running from the area. Despite his claims of innocence, he was convicted based largely on the testimony of a single eyewitness who identified him as the killer. De Luna insisted that another man, Carlos Hernandez, had committed the crime, but police dismissed his claims. At the time, authorities argued that Hernandez was a fabrication and did not exist. De Luna's trial was rushed, and his defense team failed to properly investigate his claims. No physical evidence linked him to the crime. No blood, no fingerprints, no weapon. The prosecution relied solely on the shaky eyewitness identification, which later turned out to be unreliable. He was sentenced to death in 1984 and executed by lethal injection on December 7, 1989, at the age of 27. For his final meal, de Luna requested a cheeseburger, fries, and soda. His last words were a repeated proclamation of innocence. "I didn't do it. You're about to execute an innocent man." Years after his execution, an extensive investigation by Columbia University Law School uncovered overwhelming evidence that de Luna was innocent. The real killer, Carlos Hernandez, did exist. He was a known violent criminal with a history of using knives in attacks, and he had repeatedly bragged about committing the murder while de Luna took the fall. Hernandez had been arrested multiple times for similar crimes, yet authorities had failed to pursue him as a suspect. The case was widely considered one of the most egregious, wrongful executions in US history. In 2012, Columbia Law School published a detailed report proving that Texas had executed the wrong man. De Luna's case was a devastating example of a justice system that refused to listen, even when the truth was in plain sight. But the next case is just as tragic, an execution based on flawed forensic science that led to the death of an innocent father. 14. Cameron Todd Willingham. On December 23, 1991, a fire broke out in the Corsicana, Texas home of Cameron Todd Willingham, killing his 3 young daughters. Willingham, who escaped the fire unharmed, was quickly suspected of arson. Investigators claimed they found evidence of accelerants, and witnesses alleged he showed no remorse after the fire. Willingham was arrested and charged with capital murder. Prosecutors painted him as a cold-blooded killer who set his house on fire to kill his children and rid himself of family responsibilities. The trial relied heavily on forensic analysis that suggested the fire was intentionally set, as well as testimony from a jailhouse informant who claimed Willingham had confessed. He was convicted of arson and murder in 1992 and sentenced to death. Over the years, forensic experts criticized the fire investigation, stating that the original conclusions were based on outdated, unscientific methods. Despite this, Texas courts upheld his conviction. Willingham was executed by lethal injection on February 17, 2004, at the age of 36. For his final meal, Willingham requested 3 barbecued ribs, 2 pieces of chicken, baked potato, and a Coke. His last words were filled with defiance and anger toward the state of Texas. "I am an innocent man. Never ever trust what you read." In 2011, the Texas Forensic Science Commission formally acknowledged that the fire investigation in Willingham's case had been deeply flawed. Multiple independent experts, including a report commissioned by the Innocence Project, determined that there was no evidence of arson. The fire had been accidental. Additionally, the jailhouse informant later recanted his testimony, admitting that he had lied in exchange for a reduced sentence. Willingham had been convicted based on junk science and false testimony. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his innocence, Texas officials have never formally cleared his name, but his case remains one of the most infamous wrongful executions in US history. 13th, Ruben Cantu. In 1984, 17-year-old Ruben Cantu was accused of a brutal armed robbery that resulted in the murder of Pedro Gomez, a San Antonio contractor. Cantu and an accomplice were allegedly looking for cash when they broke into a house where Gomez was staying. The man was shot multiple times but survived long enough to identify Cantu as the shooter. There was no physical evidence linking Cantu to the crime, only the testimony of the surviving victim. Despite maintaining his innocence, Cantu was arrested and charged with capital murder. Cantu was convicted in 1985, primarily based on the testimony of Juan Moreno, the sole eyewitness who had been wounded in the attack. The prosecution argued that Cantu was a violent gang member with no regard for human life. Cantu was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection on August 24, 1993, at the age of 26. For his final meal, Cantu requested fried chicken, French fries, and soda. His last words reflected his frustration and the possibility of his innocence. "I am innocent. I didn't do it, but I guess it doesn't matter now." More than a decade after Cantu's execution, Juan Moreno, the key witness, recanted his testimony, stating that he had been pressured by police to identify Cantu as the shooter. He admitted he had been unsure of the attacker's identity and had named Cantu out of fear. Further investigations revealed that there was no evidence tying Cantu to the crime scene. Additionally, Cantu's co-defendant, who had refused to testify at trial, later confirmed that Cantu had not been involved in the crime at all. In 2005, the Houston Chronicle published an extensive report detailing how Cantu had likely been wrongfully convicted and executed. Texas authorities acknowledged serious flaws in the case, but they have never formally exonerated him. 12th, Gary Graham. In 1981, 17-year-old Gary Graham was accused of murdering Bobby Lambert, a man who had been shot outside a Houston grocery store during an attempted robbery. The case against Graham rested almost entirely on the testimony of a single eyewitness who claimed she saw him commit the crime from over 30 feet away, through her car window, at night. Graham had a troubled past and was involved in several other robberies, but there was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no forensic link connecting him to Lambert's murder. During the trial, Graham's court-appointed lawyer failed to present key witnesses who could have testified that Graham was not the shooter. Instead, the case relied solely on the one eyewitness account, which was later called into question. Despite the weak evidence, Graham was convicted and sentenced to death in 1982. His case became one of the most controversial executions in US history, drawing attention from civil rights leaders, activists, and even world leaders who called for a retrial. Graham was executed by lethal injection on June 22, 2000, at the age of 36. For his final meal, Graham requested a well-done steak, baked potato, salad, and iced tea. His last words were filled with anger and frustration. "I die fighting for what I believed in. The truth will come out one day, and when it does, you will all know that you killed an innocent man." Years after Graham's execution, multiple investigations uncovered glaring flaws in the case. 2 witnesses who had seen the actual shooter said it was not Graham, but they were never called to testify. Additionally, the reliability of the prosecution's eyewitness was questioned, as experts pointed out that memory distortions and poor lighting conditions likely led to a misidentification. In 2011, the Innocence Project released a report stating that Graham had likely been wrongfully convicted and executed. While the Texas justice system has never officially exonerated him, his case remains a prime example of how a flawed trial and unreliable eyewitness testimony can lead to fatal mistakes. 11. Larry Swearingen. In 1998, 19-year-old Melissa Trotter was reported missing in Montgomery County, Texas. Her body was found 25 days later in the Sam Houston National Forest, strangled with one leg of a pair of pantyhose. Larry Swearingen was arrested shortly after her disappearance and charged with her murder. The prosecution claimed that Swearingen, who had been seen with Trotter before her disappearance, had kidnapped and killed her. However, Swearingen maintained his innocence, arguing that he had already been in jail at the time Trotter was murdered. Swearingen was convicted and sentenced to death in 2000, based on circumstantial evidence, including witness testimony that placed him with Trotter before she vanished. However, forensic experts later determined that the condition of Trotter's body indicated she had been murdered while Swearingen was already in custody. Despite this crucial evidence, Texas courts denied his appeals, and he was executed by lethal injection on August 21st, 2019, at the age of 48. For his final meal, Swearingen declined a special request and was given the standard prison meal. His last words were a direct declaration of his innocence. "Lord, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." After Swearingen's execution, forensic experts continued to examine the case. In 2021, an independent review of the autopsy confirmed that Trotter had been killed at least a week after Swearingen was jailed, making it physically impossible for him to have committed the murder. Additionally, DNA evidence found on the murder weapon did not match Swearingen, further proving his innocence. Despite these findings, Texas officials have never officially exonerated him, but his case remains one of the most glaring wrongful executions in modern US history. 10. And Claude Jones. In 1989, Claude Jones was convicted of murdering liquor store owner Alan Hilzendager during a robbery in Point Blank, Texas. The key piece of evidence linking Jones to the crime was a single strand of hair found at the scene, which prosecutors claimed matched him. Jones had a lengthy criminal record, which made him an easy target for law enforcement. Despite his insistence that he was not the shooter, he was convicted and sentenced to death, based largely on the forensic hair analysis. Jones was convicted in 1990 and sentenced to death in 1991. His appeals focused on the questionable reliability of forensic hair comparison, but the courts upheld his conviction. He was executed by lethal injection on December 7th, 2000, at the age of 60. For his final meal, Jones requested chicken fried steak, fried chicken, French fries, and apple pie. His last words were bitter but resigned. "I have nothing to say." In 2010, a decade after his execution, DNA testing was finally conducted on the hair that had been the central piece of evidence in Jones's conviction. The results revealed that the hair did not belong to Jones, it belonged to the victim, Alan Hilzendager. Had modern DNA testing been available at the time of his trial, Jones likely would have never been convicted. His case became one of the most disturbing examples of forensic science being misused to send an innocent man to his death. Despite this revelation, Texas has never officially exonerated him. 9. Troy Davis. On August 19, 1989, off-duty police officer Mark MacPhail was shot and killed in Savannah, Georgia, Georgia, while attempting to break up a fight in a parking lot. Witnesses at the scene identified 20-year-old Troy Davis as the shooter, and he was arrested shortly after. There was no physical evidence linking Davis to the crime, no gun, no fingerprints, and no DNA. His conviction relied entirely on eyewitness testimony. Davis was convicted in 1991 and sentenced to death. Over the years, his case gained international attention because of the questionable nature of the evidence against him. By the late 2000s, 7 out of the 9 eyewitnesses who had testified against him recanted their statements, claiming they had been pressured by police to identify Davis as the killer. Some even named another man as the real shooter. Despite these revelations, the courts denied Davis a new trial. Davis was executed by lethal injection on September 21st, 2011, at the age of 42. For his final meal, Davis declined a special request and ate the standard prison meal. His last words were a powerful declaration of his innocence. "I am innocent. The truth will come out one day. I did not kill your son, father, or brother. May God have mercy on your souls." In 2018, an independent investigation by the Innocence Project and the Georgia Bureau of Investigations revealed severe flaws in the case. The new report concluded that there was no reliable evidence proving that Davis was the shooter. Though Georgia has never officially exonerated him, the overwhelming doubts surrounding his case have made it one of the most infamous wrongful executions in American history. Davis's case remains a major symbol in the fight against the death penalty. 8. Leo Jones. On May 23, 1981, police officer Thomas Safransky was shot and killed while sitting in his patrol car in Jacksonville, Florida. Within hours, 21-year-old Leo Jones was arrested and charged with the murder. Jones was interrogated for hours and later signed a confession. But he quickly retracted it, claiming that he had been beaten and coerced by police into confessing. His defense attorneys later presented evidence that officers had used excessive force during the interrogation, but the court rejected his claims. Jones's trial was rushed, and despite inconsistencies in the evidence, he was convicted of first-degree murder in 1981 and sentenced to death. His execution was delayed multiple times due to legal challenges, but Florida courts refused to overturn his conviction. Jones was executed by electric chair on March 24, 1998, at the age of 47. For his last meal, Jones requested fried shrimp, fried oysters, a baked potato, and a strawberry milkshake. His final words before execution were, "Bye. I am an innocent man. I never killed anyone, and you are all making a mistake." In 2017, nearly 20 years after his execution, newly uncovered evidence revealed that Jones had likely been framed. A retired police officer admitted that another officer had bragged about beating Jones to force a confession. Additionally, another suspect had been named in police reports but was never investigated. The Florida Supreme Court later acknowledged that Jones's conviction had been based on unreliable testimony and coerced confessions. Though he was never officially exonerated by the state, his case remains one of the most egregious examples of wrongful execution in US history. 7. David Spence. In 1982, 3 teenagers, Jill Montgomery, Kenneth Franks, and Raylene Rice, were brutally murdered near Lake Waco, Texas. The case remained unsolved for years, until police charged David Spence, a local man with a criminal record, with the killings. The prosecution claimed that Spence had been hired by a convenience store owner to kill another woman, but he mistakenly killed the 3 teenagers instead. There was no physical evidence linking Spence to the crime, no fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon. Instead, the case against him relied entirely on the testimony of jailhouse informants who claimed he had confessed. Spence was convicted in 1984 based on informant testimony and sentenced to death. His lawyers argued that the informants had been given deals in exchange for their testimony, but the jury still found him guilty. Despite multiple appeals citing a lack of physical evidence, Texas courts upheld his conviction. He was executed by lethal injection on April 3, 1997, at the age of 39. For his final meal, Spence requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, corn, and iced tea. His last words were a final statement of innocence. "I am an innocent man. This is a miscarriage of justice. May God have mercy on you all." Years after his execution, investigative journalists and legal experts uncovered serious flaws in the case. The jailhouse informants admitted that they had fabricated their testimonies in exchange for reduced sentences. Further, the convenience store owner who was allegedly involved was never convicted of any crime. In 2012, an independent forensic review found no evidence linking Spence to the crime scene. Additionally, former police officers admitted that the case had been mishandled, and new suspects were identified. Though Texas has never officially exonerated him, Spence's wrongful conviction remains one of the most controversial in death penalty history. 6. Joseph Odell. In 1985, Joseph Odell was convicted of the rape and murder of 44-year-old Helen Shartner in Virginia Beach. Prosecutors claimed that blood evidence found on Odell's clothes matched Shartner's, and his prior criminal history made him a prime suspect. There were no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, and no clear motive. The entire case against Odell was built on forensic evidence that prosecutors said placed him at the crime scene. Odell was convicted in 1986 and sentenced to death. Over the years, his legal team repeatedly requested DNA testing of the evidence, believing it would prove his innocence. However, Virginia courts refused to allow the testing, fearing it could overturn his conviction. Despite mounting pressure from activists, legal experts, and even the Pope, Odell was executed by lethal injection on July 23, 1997, at the age of 54. For his final meal, Odell requested a meatball sub, fries, and a Coca-Cola. His last words were a final plea for the truth. "The world will one day know I was innocent. Do not let them get away with this." In 2017, 20 years after Odell's execution, forensic experts re-examined the case. It was discovered that the original blood analysis used to convict him had been completely flawed. DNA testing finally conducted on the evidence revealed that it did not match Odell, proving that he had not been the killer. His case became one of the most infamous examples of wrongful execution due to the state's refusal to allow DNA testing before his death. Despite these findings, Virginia has never officially exonerated him, but his case remains a devastating example of how forensic errors can lead to the execution of an innocent person. 5. Ellis Wayne Felker. In 1981, a 19-year-old college student, Evelyn Joy Ludlam, disappeared in Warner Robins, Georgia. Her body was found days later in a creek, raped and murdered. Authorities quickly focused on Ellis Wayne Felker, a 40-year-old man who had been under surveillance as part of a separate rape investigation. There was no direct evidence tying Felker to the murder. Prosecutors relied on circumstantial evidence, jailhouse informants, and forensic testimony that was later questioned. Felker was convicted in 1983 and sentenced to death. His defense attorneys repeatedly requested DNA testing and access to suppressed police files, but Georgia courts denied their appeals. Over the years, numerous flaws in the case emerged, including missing evidence and allegations of prosecutorial misconduct. Despite these concerns, Felker was executed by electrocution on November 15, 1996, at the age of 48. For his final meal, Felker requested steak, baked potato, green beans, bread, and iced tea. His last words were, "You are executing an innocent man. I never hurt anyone. One day the truth will come out." In 2014, a re-examination of the case found that key evidence had been withheld from Felker's defense. DNA testing on preserved samples revealed that none of the biological evidence matched Felker. Additionally, another man had confessed to the crime before Felker's execution, but the confession was ignored. Though Georgia has never formally exonerated Felker, legal experts and innocence organizations widely regard him as wrongfully executed. His case remains a glaring example of how the justice system ignored critical evidence in a rush to secure a conviction. 4. Jesse Tafero. On February 20th, 1976, Florida State Trooper Philip Black and a Canadian constable were shot and killed during a routine traffic stop at a rest area. Jesse Tafero, his girlfriend, Sonia Jacobs, and their friend Walter Rhodes were in the parked car. When the officers approached, a shootout ensued, resulting in the deaths of both law enforcement officers. Rhodes, who was driving the car, immediately took a plea deal in exchange for a reduced sentence. He claimed that Tafero was the one who fired the fatal shots. Despite evidence that only Rhodes had gunpowder residue on his hands, Tafero and Jacobs were both convicted. Tafero received the death penalty, while Jacobs was sentenced to life in prison. Tafero spent 14 years on death row, maintaining his innocence. Meanwhile, Rhodes, who had been the prosecution's star witness, was released after just a few years in prison. Tafero was executed in the electric chair on May 4th, 1990, at the age of 43. His execution was botched. The electric chair malfunctioned, causing his head to catch on fire before he finally died. For his last meal, Tafero requested fried chicken, eggs, toast, and coffee. His last words were, "I am an innocent man. This is a crime against justice." In 1992, Sonia Jacobs' conviction was overturned after new evidence surfaced, proving that police had suppressed key evidence. She was released after spending 16 years in prison. Rhodes, the original witness against Tafero, later confessed that he was the real shooter and had falsely implicated Tafero to secure his plea deal. In 1998, after years of investigation, legal experts confirmed that Tafero had likely been innocent. Despite overwhelming evidence, Florida has never officially exonerated him, but his case remains one of the most infamous wrongful executions in US history. 3. George Stinney Jr. In March 1944, two young white girls, Betty June Binnicker, 11, and Mary Emma Thames, 7, were found brutally murdered in Alcolu, South Carolina. Their skulls had been crushed with a railroad spike. Within hours, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr., a black teenager, was arrested. He was accused of killing the girls after allegedly speaking to them earlier that day. There was no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no motive, but authorities were eager for a quick conviction. Stinney was interrogated without a lawyer or his parents present. According to police, he confessed to the crime, though no written or recorded confession was ever produced. His trial lasted just 2 hours, and the jury, comprised entirely of white men, convicted him in just 10 minutes. He was sentenced to death. His defense attorney presented no witnesses and filed no appeals. On June 16, 1944, just 83 days after his arrest, George Stinney Jr. was executed in the electric chair. At just 14 years old, he became the youngest person executed in the US in the 20th century. Because he was so young, Stinney was not offered a last meal. His last words were reportedly, "I didn't do it, why am I here?" For decades, activists and legal experts fought to clear Stinney's name. In 2014, after 70 years, a South Carolina judge vacated his conviction, ruling that his trial had been a blatant miscarriage of justice. The court recognized that his confession had likely been coerced and that he had never received a fair trial. Though his exoneration came far too late, Stinney's case remains one of the most infamous wrongful executions in US history, highlighting the deep racial injustices in the American legal system. 2. Willie McGee. In 1945, Willie McGee, a black man from Laurel, Mississippi, was arrested and charged with the rape of a white woman, Willette Hawkins. Despite no physical evidence and McGee's claim that he and Hawkins had a consensual relationship, he was convicted in a deeply racially charged trial. McGee's case was one of the most controversial of the Jim Crow era, as it highlighted the deep racial injustices in the South, where false accusations against black men frequently led to executions. McGee's first trial lasted just 1 day, and he was convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to death. After legal challenges from civil rights activists, 2 additional trials were held, but both resulted in the same verdict. His case gained national attention, with even Albert Einstein and William Faulkner speaking out against his conviction. Despite mounting pressure from civil rights groups, Mississippi courts refused to grant him clemency. McGee was executed in the electric chair on May 8, 1951, at the age of 37. For his last meal, McGee declined a special request and was given the standard prison meal. His last words were, "I have nothing to say. I did not do this." In 2020, legal scholars and civil rights groups revisited McGee's case, uncovering evidence that he had been falsely accused as part of a larger pattern of racial injustice in the Deep South. Willette Hawkins' family later admitted that her accusation had likely been false and driven by societal pressures. Though Mississippi has never officially exonerated McGee, historians widely agree that he was wrongly executed, making his case one of the most infamous racial injustices in American history. 1. Thomas and Meeks Griffin. In 1913, 2 black landowning brothers, Thomas and Meeks Griffin, were arrested for the murder of a Confederate veteran named John Q. Lewis in Chester County, South Carolina. The case against them was built entirely on the false testimony of a convicted felon who claimed the brothers were involved in the crime. There was no physical evidence, and both men maintained their innocence. The Griffins were successful farmers and respected members of their community, which many historians believe made them targets for wrongful conviction in a racially biased legal system. Despite weak evidence and contradictory witness statements, the Griffin brothers were convicted in a rushed trial and sentenced to death in 1914. At the time, many in their town protested the conviction, arguing that the real killer was someone else and that the brothers had been framed. However, their appeals were denied. On September 29, 1915, Thomas and Meeks Griffin were executed via the electric chair, making them 2 of the oldest people ever put to death in South Carolina at ages 50 and 52. There is no official record of their last meal request, but historical reports indicate that both men were calm and dignified in their final moments, with their last words being a simple proclamation of innocence. "We did not do this. God knows the truth." Nearly a century later, in 2009, the South Carolina Board of Pardons and Paroles posthumously pardoned Thomas and Meeks Griffin after new evidence proved they had been wrongfully convicted. Historians found records showing that the key witness had fabricated his testimony in exchange for a lighter sentence. and that local authorities had targeted the Griffins due to their wealth and status as black landowners in the Jim Crow South. Their posthumous exoneration made them the first black men in South Carolina history to be officially pardoned after an execution, highlighting the deep injustices of the early 20th century legal system.